Hey, welcome to another exciting edition of the Give Me Liberty podcast. We have in the house the infamous Bee Chief, CEO of Babylon Bee, Seth Dillon, joining the Give Me Liberty podcast starting now. Hey, welcome back to the Give Me Liberty podcast. Joined today by special guest, CEO of Babylon Bee, my friend Seth Dillon. You need no introduction, but welcome.
Thanks for having me back.
Hey, I'm super thrilled, and I just want to dive in to obviously something that's on the top of everybody's mind. I read an article today, even at World Magazine, by Eric Reed, a pastor in Tennessee, just in support of the words, the comments you offered on the Joe Rogan Experience. Obviously, one of the largest platforms in the country, 11 million listeners per episode. That dwarfs Tucker Carlson by like 8 million, I think. You were on there. You gave a vociferous defense of the pro-life argument, and you didn't back down, and you didn't nuance or couch your words either.
No, I've had a lot of people ask me if I knew what topics we were going to be discussing ahead of time, like if this was a planned thing or if there was some kind of outline or, topical breakdown. And there's none of that with Rogan. You just sit down and have a discussion, So I did not expect to go into that topic with him in that conversation. I mean, I just expected to be talking about censorship, big tech stuff, the things that we're typically dealing with, cancel culture and comedy. But yeah, I don't even honestly remember how we got into that discussion. I'd have to go back and watch it to see how it started. I don't know if I'm the one who started or if he's the one who started it, but you're right. I mean, there is no bigger platform than Rogan's show. And so to have a candid conversation about that issue between two people who disagree, he's definitely on the pro-choice side of things, although, he seems to lean towards defending the view that says this should be okay in exception circumstances, like the rape of a teenager, for example, which is what he came out the gate swinging with. But then I, on the other hand, I was defending the position, not just that, we should value life, but that we should value life in all circumstances, even these extreme circumstances where you have, a teenager who's pregnant, who didn't intend to be, who was violated. It's a very, very, very tough circumstance. But man, I mean, to have the opportunity to stand for life in that context on that platform was just really cool. I'm sure God had a hand in that. And I've been overwhelmed with the response that we've heard from people who are just, I think, kind of rejoicing in the fact that there's this view was voiced on this platform. And I'm just glad I didn't choke and say something stupid.
Well, no, it was so, you had so much poise and command. And then you had a very logical syllogism that you did in there. And I don't even know if any of that was planned, but it was, like you say, it wasn't planned, but it was just an amazing auto response, Yeah. Murder is wrong, abortion is murder, therefore abortion is wrong. It's very simple. I mean, Seth, there are pastors, I hate to say this, that can't even articulate it that clearly. I go back to Carl Lentz, there on The View, who represented Hillsong, New York, and just a few short years ago could not advocate as strongly as you did. And he was put on the spot, and he was there to specifically represent that viewpoint, and he couldn't do it. So, you think about it, and the way Joe Rogan phrased it, for those who didn't watch it, I think probably everybody's heard of it now, but he says, you don't have the right to tell my 14-year-old daughter she has to carry her rapist's baby. And that, the way in which that's positioned, that puts almost anyone on the defensive. I mean, that's the moment in which many weather vane Christians fold. And they say, I don't know how to respond to this. I fumble at this point.
Well, I mean, it's tough for a number of reasons, right? He has a 14-year-old daughter. And so he's imagining a scenario that would be extremely difficult for him and his family to deal with personally. And so that brings kind of passions and convictions to the surface, and he gets really, animated about it. and brings, and I think that's, it's one of the toughest cases to try to deal with in this conversation, because you end up with, there's the mentality that everyone gets into is, well, this is a victim. We have a victim here, and what's the best way to handle this victim?
Right.
In a really tragic circumstance. And I wanted to stay calm. I was very conscious of the fact that there were a lot of people watching, or that there would be a lot of people watching when it aired. And so I really wanted to stay calm and stay logical. You mentioned the syllogism. Yeah, the syllogism that I laid out for him was, it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human life. Abortion intentionally kills an innocent human life. Therefore, abortion is wrong. And it's not even, I didn't even use the word murder. I mean, when I'm talking about intentionally killing an innocent human life, we're talking about, is the preborn at every stage of development of human life? And the answer to that, scientifically, this is not a religious argument. And he tried to frame it in terms of, oh, well, this is what you believe in your religion, and I respect that. But the argument that this is a human life is something that you can back with science. It's a human life from conception. It's a human person in development. And so, when you frame it in those terms, if it's always wrong to kill an innocent human, then it's wrong in the case of abortion. And it doesn't matter how the human came to exist. And this is the crazy thing too. These stories have so many sides to them. You have to zoom out. You can get caught in this scenario where they say, oh, you have no right to say this. And it's like, now, wait a minute. It's not about my rights and me trying to force something on somebody. It's about what's right and wrong, right? And, of course, would you stand there and tell somebody, you have no right to say that a mother shouldn't be allowed to drown her 2-year-old in the tub if she wants to? Of course you have a right to say that. It's wrong for a mother to drown her child in the tub. Even if it's not your child, it's her child. It's still not her decision. It's not her body. And that's
right.
Where this abortion debate gets completely off the rails, is when we start using euphemisms, or we start saying dishonest things like, it's her body, it's her choice. You have no right to tell her what to do with her body. There's another body, there's another human life in the picture. And that is a scientific argument you can make, a logical argument you can make. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to cite the Bible. Obviously, as Christians, we believe that every human is made in God's image, but you don't have to go there to make the argument for pro-life.
Yeah. I saw more recently, gubernatorial candidate in Georgia, Tracy, I think that's right. Gosh, I have that name right. But anyway, she was at a church more recently, talking and giving religious arguments, euphemistically using these arguments in sort of under the guise of religious language. Brother's keeper. There's a meanness and a cruelty that those people who have misused and abused Christianity in order to achieve their own political ends. And that's literally what she was doing, and sort of in the opposite. She was basically trying to obfuscate the facts, the scientific facts, and she was trying to use sort of religious language to smokescreen, her position on abortion.
I don't like that at all.
Yeah, I hate that. And so it's funny, I want to say the irony of the whole thing. You're the CEO of Babylon Bee. You run the largest satirical website on the planet. Everybody knows you guys for making comedy or using comedy, irony, and humor to make a point. This was your most not the Bee moment, right? Where you basically was like, whoa, this is a serious Christian. What gives you sort of, in terms of background, I know a little bit about your story. You're at Palm Beach Atlantic University, but for the listeners, this conviction obviously is not something that you got overnight. Give us a little bit of your faith background.
I was raised in the church. My dad was a pastor. So all through my childhood, I was in the church. I was learning in Sunday school and in youth group and sitting in the pews while my dad preached on Sunday. A good theological foundation was laid from an early age for me. And I think that was, you can't ask for more than that. And so beyond that, though, I've just developed a lot of personal interests in my own study for what I read. I read a lot of Christian apologetics. I read a lot of philosophy, and I've read widely on the topic of abortion and the pro-life arguments. And I think these are important things to study. You don't want to have a surface level understanding of these things, because then when the moment comes when you have to defend your position, you're ill-equipped to do it. And so, I was able to, without preparation, respond to Rogan because the last 10 years of my life have been preparation for discussions like that. And I talk about it all the time. My Twitter is a mixture of satirical jokes and retweets of the Babylon Bee and more serious stuff, like saying that abortion is healthcare the way that rape is lovemaking. I mean, that's
right.
Something that I had tweeted. And so I had that on my mind because I had recently tweeted it. And so I was able to pull it out in that discussion with Joe to make the point that these are actually opposites. It's not what they're saying that it is. These are euphemisms that we're using to try to cover up and put makeup on something that's really ugly. And so, the preparation is not something, it's not just like overnight. It's just a lifetime of study, both, in the Bible and in philosophy and rational argumentation on these issues. So, there's a lot of people I could give credit to for that in my life, my own life. But I mean, that's kind of like where I was coming from on it. It's, satire too. When you mentioned satire, I'm the CEO of a satire site. Satire is serious business at times. People will tell me, they'll look at one of our jokes that kind of stings or is a little bit, for them, cringe because it hits on some issue that's near and dear to them. And they'll get really mad at us and they'll be like, this isn't funny. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe it wasn't supposed to be funny. Maybe you're not supposed to be laughing at that one. Maybe there's a point that we're making there. Satire can be serious business. And so a lot of the writers that we have on staff are serious thinking Christians who have a worldview and they're expressing it through humor. It doesn't mean that you should take them lightly.
Okay, so on that note, you obviously have critics that are out there, non-Christian,
Really?
Christian alike.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, but I think about moments in Scripture where sarcasm is used as a response, as an appropriate, righteous response. I think the most obvious one that I think many people call upon is the moment of Elijah at Mount Carmel, and he's calling out the prophets of Baal, and he's mocking them. He's mocking them and their beliefs, and he's using sarcastic language basically to debase them, but ultimately he's attacking their God who's fake, right? He's not the real, true, living God, Yahweh, but he's attacking their gods. You think about today, there's a lot of people out there that they're kind of the self-appointed tone police, so to speak. What's your response to some of those critics that are out there? And I would even say Christians. What would be your response?
Well, we do get a lot of criticism for engaging in mockery. Mockery can be a very negative thing. I think that you have to make a distinction between mockery that's intended to, just make somebody feel bad about themselves and tear them down, because that happens all the time. There's forms of bullying and picking on somebody and, just being mean and cruel for the sake of being mean and cruel. And then there's what, the religious satirist is trying to accomplish, which is, and I mentioned this in my conversation with Rogan, it's the marriage of wit with moral concern. And you're trying to use like humor and wit, irony, exaggeration, pairing that with moral concern to draw attention to something that needs to be addressed, some kind of social cancer, something that's bad that has to be dealt with. And you can do that very effectively with mockery, irony, and humor and exaggeration. And so that's where satire comes into play. And I think you can make a moral argument for mockery is that, look, and this is something else I said on his show. I said it very forcefully. The absurd has only become sacred because it hasn't been sufficiently mocked. The absurd's only become sacred because it hasn't been sufficiently mocked. We have so many crazy ideas, harmful ideas that are bad for everyone, but especially young people. The idea that a 3-year-old can be transgender and we need to start socially transitioning them, getting them on puberty blockers when they're old enough, and starting a surgical process to set them down this path to become the other gender, which is impossible. Ideas like this, there's nothing more deserving of mockery than ideas that harm people. And so to use satire as a weapon to attack those ideas and tear them down and kind of like, and put them on the sidelines where they're no longer in consideration for something that we should take seriously. Mockery can do that. And if mockery can help us accomplish that, because, what I say all the time is, young people, especially young people, lack any sort of strengthened worldview or philosophical foundation or theological foundation to ward off these bad ideas. They just absorb them. And so comedians and satirists, humorists, they can play a very substantial role, I think, in communicating to young people the absurdity of the absurd so that they don't take it seriously. There is a moral good to that, And so it's all about when people start saying, you shouldn't be mocking, whatever, a lot of times they're kind of prejudging your motives and they're getting your motives wrong. I know for a fact what my motives are. They're getting my motives wrong if they think I'm out to hurt people, Yeah. We're not, like I said in the interview with Rogan, we're not running around with a knife trying to stab people and hurt them. We're more like the surgeon with the scalpel trying to excise the cancer before it can kill the patient. Yeah. If you understand the difference between those two cuts, because both cut you, both sting, both hurt, but one cut is intended to wound, the other is intended for healing.
Yeah, well said. I think about, in many ways, the parables that Jesus spoke. He would use agrarian, agricultural, common things, parable of the seeds and the sower, right? All of these things. And there was a lot of parables, economic parables, parables that people would have commonly understood, that related to everyday life. Today, it almost as if the parabolic statements are in the form of comedy and memes and those types of things, pithy sayings, things that people can understand easily. But what I appreciate about you that you articulated earlier, you can't meme your way to deep convictions. You might be able to get people's attention, but ultimately you hit the books, you spent time studying God's word and obviously being exposed to other books on worldview, apologetics, philosophy, all of those things. You had to mine deeply to come to deep convictions. But these things are a way to sort of get a hold of the general populace.
Yeah, I would say that's about right. I mean, it's one of those things where I quote Chesterton all the time. I've done this in a lot of my public talks. I love this quote where he said that humor can get in under the door while seriousness is still fumbling at the handle. I think on a popular level, humor can be a very effective way of drawing attention to some issues that people would ignore if you're dealing with them on a deeper analytical or philosophical level. You're going to talk right over people's heads. It's more difficult to grapple with. They need a little bit more of a background in what you're talking about to even understand the terminology that you're using. But when you move out of that sphere into comedy and humor, you can kind of speak to everybody. So yeah, I think that's a way. It's a way of broadening and drawing attention to some things that sidesteps that problem, that communication problem that you can run into when you get like too heady with people or too academic or scholarly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, so who biggest influence in your life in terms of apologetics or worldview, biggest influence in your life in terms of comedy? And by the way, the comedy part does not have to be a Christian.
Those are great questions. On apologetics, I have to say hands down, C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
He's influenced so many people. And I often hear criticism from serious philosophers who say that, you can't really take Lewis that seriously. I think C.S. Lewis was remarkably effective at communicating really difficult ideas in a really plain language. And I don't think that he got everything right. But when it came to understanding certain things, like certain ways of looking at things, I think his moral argument in Mere Christianity is fantastic. He draws our attention to the fact that if you have, when you're looking at something that's unjust, you think something, somebody's wronged you, they've done something that offends you. Well, based on what standard are you considering it unjust? You have to have this idea of a perfect standard of justice in order to judge anything as being unjust. And he does an excellent job of drawing attention to that. The moral argument there is very powerful, and there's a lot of deep thinkers and scientists, people like Francis Collins, who wrote The Language of God, he credits C.S. Lewis with leading him down a path towards Christianity and giving him kind of intellectual permission to engage in a faith journey because of arguments like that. So, Lewis has had tremendous impact beyond me personally. Millions have been impacted by him. But on the other side, on the comedy side, I want to mention one other thing by Lewis too. My favorite apologetics argument is not the moral argument, but the argument from reason. Are you familiar with the argument from reason?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just the reason I love it so much is because it gets behind all of the other arguments. C.S. Lewis in the third chapter of Miracles, he's talking about the cardinal difficulty of naturalism. He's talking about the main problem with naturalism is that it views the world as this closed system where there's nothing outside it influencing it. It's just this cause and effect system where one thing bumps into another, one molecule bumps into another, and things just happen. There's this cascade of events. And every event that happens, you can trace, if you knew everything about the universe, you could trace that event all the way back to the beginning in some causal chain, right? And in that context, there's no room for reasoning. There's no room for reaching conclusions based on the fact that you have logical insight into the relation between, the syllogism I gave for abortion. We can see that the conclusion follows from the premises, and that's how we reach the conclusion. But on a naturalistic worldview, which doesn't allow for the cause and effect of like rational thinking, it's all happening under the surface at a biochemical level with causes and effects, and whatever thoughts your brain has are the result of these underlying biochemical causes and effects. Rational thinking is just excluded from the universe on that view. Like it can't have an impact on the world. Everything is from the bottom up, not the top down. And so the argument from reason is interesting because you can't even have a rational argument unless you concede that something like Christian theism is true. And I have not done justice to the argument with that summary of it, but he basically said, one way of summarizing it, he said that unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought. Therefore, I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. So that's kind of an introduction to that argument. I encourage people to go look into it more because that one's awesome. But on the comedy side, honestly, the biggest influence on me growing up was The Simpsons. I loved The Simpsons.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah. And
I love the first 10 seasons, and I stopped watching at a certain point. But Matt Groening basically created a whole new genre of comedy that was not really meant. It's not like Looney Tunes. There was a certain generation that did not understand at all, and it was all commentary and satire. Yeah. I also loved. There was this funny site that came along I wouldn't call this the biggest influence on me, but it did train me to think in terms of one-liner jokes. And it was called Some E-Cards. I don't know if you're familiar with Some E-Cards, but it was a humor-based e-card website that just has, simple e-cards with a little one-liner joke on them. And the writers are really, really sharp, and they're very, very funny. Some of them are raunchy. But when I became introduced to that site, I started working on writing jokes in that format. And that really served me well for, the Bee, because that's what the Bee does with headlines. You basically have a joke in a one-liner in the headline. So training myself to think in those terms, sites like that have had an influence on me. But yeah, definitely The Simpsons. I would give the credit for making me fall in love with witty one-liners and finding funny satirical ways of looking at things and becoming a prophet and predicting the future. The Simpsons is better at that than anyone. Absolutely. They predicted Trump way before Trump even predicted Trump, which is Brilliant. Incredible.
Yeah.
The other one I was going to throw in there, I don't know if you ever, Deep Thoughts by Jack Handey, if you ever saw the old SNL, where they would read those. And if you read through them, it was always brilliantly delivered. The way it was written, where the punchline would just come through and you'd be like, what? It was so odd. But yeah, those things are hilarious.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Seth, thank you so much for joining the Give Me Liberty podcast. We certainly have enjoyed it. And every time you come to Liberty University, our students appreciate it. We're looking forward to our conference coming up, and we hope to have you there.
Yeah, I'd love to be there. November, right? November
4 and 5. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Standing for Freedom Conference. So look forward to seeing you, and thank you for representing the faith once for all delivered to the saints, biblical truth, and Christ and the gospel. Yeah,
hey, there's no greater feeling. I know it sounds funny to non-believers to say that it feels good to be used, but to be used by God, there's nothing better than that.
Amen. Well, God bless you, friend. And folks, stick around for final thoughts. Hey, thank you for joining the Give Me Liberty podcast. Wasn't that a great conversation with Seth Dillon? One of the things I really appreciate about him is that he is not somebody who has memed himself into deep Christian conviction, but he is somebody who has studied the source of Christian truth. That's the Word of God. Somebody who has spent well over a decade studying these deep philosophical questions and apologetics, somebody who understands that a biblical worldview must begin with God's authority, His Word. Super important. The conversation that he had on the Joe Rogan Experience is something that I think impacted many people nationwide. Over 10 million potential listeners, viewers who saw that, many of them hearing that kind of argument for the first time. You never know, as a Christian, when you might be called to give a defense for the hope that is in you. One of the commendations that we receive from the Scripture is something that Peter said: always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that is in you, and do so with gentleness and respect. Until next time, God bless you.